Hi there, this is Nathaniel Moore. In a previous video, I discussed how easy it was to bypass a fully up-to-date and patched Windows 11 machine with Defender running on that machine. The purpose of that demo was really to highlight why relying on default security mechanisms just isn't sufficient, and that you cannot be complacent in this day and age. And it kind of highlighted the need for a sophisticated EDR solution. That said, while the video wasn't intended to be competitive in nature, I did receive quite a lot of questions about Defender for Enterprise and whether that would fare any different. So I set out in this video, essentially part 2, to revisit that attack scenario and to see whether Defender would indeed fare better when it was configured in its Enterprise variant with the additional EDR functionality. So to recap the attack scenario, the idea is that the Windows 11 machine, fully up to date, fully patched, the victim would receive a payload that they would execute under the illusion that it was sent internally from their IT team. That payload would in the background create a reverse shell connection to a Kali Linux C2 server, which would enable the attacker to execute remote commands. As part of the scripts of that payload, it would also elevate privileges, bypass UAC, bypass Windows Defender, and through that they could then transfer Meterpreter, continue the attack by evading defenses, setting up persistence mechanisms, and finally collecting, exfiltrating, and encrypting data. Does Defender for Enterprise fare any better versus Free Defender when protecting against this attack scenario? Well, yes and no. When I first ran the same attack against the machine running Defender for Enterprise, it was indeed blocked. And I thought, okay, well that proves my point. Don't rely on default security. Defender for Enterprise has additional mechanisms that we're able to protect. Well, that optimism didn't last long. I quickly realized that if you ran the same attack in quick succession, for whatever reason, Defender would let it walk right on through. I figured out later that it was some kind of caching or timing mechanism, and if I was to build in a looping mechanism into my payload, into my scripts, that upon the first detection and block of the reverse shell, for example, a subsequent reverse shell would spin up and Defender would then simply ignore it. So to demonstrate that, let's jump right in. So let's move over to our Windows 11 machine, and here you can see that it is fully up to date as of the 9th of January, and Windows Defender is also up to date. If we look at the configuration, you can see this is being managed by Defender for Enterprise. Everything is turned on apart from automatic sample submission, and this is simply because I don't want my payload being automatically submitted to Microsoft, and then if I'm running this demonstration multiple times, if they do write a signature, having to recompile that each time. So it just makes my life a bit easier, but it has no bearing on the attack itself. To show this from a Defender for Enterprise perspective, if we look at our assets, the machine I'm using is this one here. In terms of configuration, I have these policies that are assigned to the device. So we'll just take a quick look at the AV policy. And I'll scroll through this if you want to pause the screen and just check any of the configurations I have. But this is basically an out-of-the-box policy. The only thing I have turned off is the sample submission. Everything else is either left as default or I have turned on additional components just to see if I could give Defender, kind of a better chance of preventing the attack. That said, I also turned on attack surface reduction rules just to see if that would make any difference. So all of those are turned on to block as well, as this is a common recommendation by Microsoft to enable these. So I thought I'd give them a chance again and turn those on as well. So all of these policies are assigned to that Lapdog EMEA CX device, and they are synchronized. From the Kali perspective, we have our Netcat listener for the first session, and then we have our Meterpreter listener ready and waiting for the follow-up session. So same as before, we're just going to close this down and we're going to execute that payload. Now in the background, this is going to run some various PowerShell scripts to establish that reverse shell and to bypass UAC. Now as before, Defender will detect this bypass mechanism and it will report to block it, but in fact the reverse shell is still established. As you can see here, we have our reverse shell, same as before. So we can do who am I groups. Again, we have high mandatory level, bypassed UAC, full administrative access. We can now do what we want. So the first thing we might want to do is have a look at how Defender is configured. And we can do that with get MP preference. So again, you can have a look at the configuration here if you want to. The only exclusion I have set up is where I have the backup of my payload on the device in case I need to restore it. But the actual payload itself is executed from the desktop, so that is not affected here. And then as we scroll up, you can see, for example, the ASR rules that are configured, just to demonstrate that that is synchronized. But if we want to transfer our Meterpreter payload and execute it, we need to add some exclusions into Defender, which will allow us to execute Meterpreter from that path. So we'll do that with add MP preference, and we'll add a couple of exclusions for those temporary directories. And then we will transfer Meterpreter and execute that. So this script will download Meterpreter, it will use 7-zip to extract that encrypted payload, and then it will execute it. You can see in red, I had to add one additional line in order to bypass Defender for Enterprise, because again, Defender would block the first session. But if I built a looping mechanism that detected whether the process was running or not, if it wasn't running, it will simply execute it again. And for whatever reason, Defender for Enterprise ignores the subsequent process start. So the second session always gets through. So you should see that play out here in this window. We'll see session 1 established. Defender will detect that, it will block it. The script will then loop, and then session 2 will be established. So we'll just let that play out. As you can see, session 1 closed, session 2 open, and that will stay open for us. So we'll interact with that session, and we'll do get UID. You can see this is the user that we're connected to. And if we do sysinfo, you can see labdog EMEA CX, the device I showed you earlier. And just to further prove this, we can do screenshot. And there is a screenshot of our Windows device we are connected to. But to make things a bit more scary, as before, we can do keyscan. So on the device, we can say MDE demo, keyscan dump, MDE demo. So whether this is passwords, usernames, credit card information, anything the user types, essentially in real time we can capture that and read that on the Kali machine. The next thing we want to do, however, is try and fly under the radar, because this is going to show as a generic service or some sort of Meterpreter service. So this is the process ID that we are currently running as, but we want to migrate this into something that is more legitimate, that will fly under the radar. So let's look at WinLogon. And this service is available pre and post logon, which will allow us to hijack it and maintain a degree of persistence and fly under the radar as that service. So if we migrate to this process, this will perform process injection into WinLogon. And then if we do get PID now, you can see we've got the process ID of WinLogon. We can also do get UID, and you can see rather than running as the user, we are now running as system. So this allows us to do more damage. We can load Kiwi as an extension, and then we can do Kiwi command. LSA dump cache. And this will show us the MS cache v2 of the user that we are connected to. So the reason this is a problem is because we can take a command like this, open up a new window, and we can crack that password. So this is going to download a password list file. It's going to unzip it. It's going to then use Hashcat to attempt to crack that password. Now I'm cheating a little bit here. You'll notice on the end I have local password list. This is just to expedite the process. So I've got the password in that file, but in the real world you'd have to let it churn through and extract that password. But for the purpose of the demo, we've sped things up. And you can see here the hash has been cracked to be ABC123!. So as the attacker, you could take this password, we could move laterally, we could try and hack into some other accounts that they may be reusing the same password on. But what we're going to do now is we're just going to background this interpreter session, because at the end of the day, if the user reboots their machine or the security team terminates the process that we're using or terminates the session we're connected to, we've lost access, right? So we need to maintain some degree of persistence. And we can use a built-in Metasploit mechanism called persistence service. And we'll set the listener port to the one that we are currently using, and we'll set the session to the one that we are also currently using. And then we'll just run that, and this will transfer various configurations, registry modifications, service start mechanisms, and so on to the victim, so that in the event that we are killed on this session, a subsequent session will be reestablished. So to demonstrate that, if we interact with our most recent session here and reboot, you can see on the Windows 11 side of things, this machine is now restarting. And here we go. The machine has booted back up. We're going to move over to our Kali Linux machine, and you can see without interacting with the device, we have a new interpreter session. So if we interact with our new session 6 and we do get UID, you can see that we're running as system once again. So the user doesn't have to log in. We can continue to work on their machine. Perhaps they've started a new day at work and they've not logged in yet. Doesn't matter. As long as that machine is powered on, we can continue to work on it even through the night if we need to. But what I'm going to do now is change a directory to where the user is working from. And for the purpose of the demo, I've set up a folder called sensitive. And in that folder are various files, some of which we may have interest in, such as financial records. We can open that file up. You can see here it just says this is financial data, but obviously with the real thing, you can imagine the gold mine that would light up the eyes of the attacker. So they may then decide to download it. So now we've downloaded everything that is in that directory. Once we've got that, the natural next step of any attacker is to maintain some degree of leverage, right? So yes, we've got their files, we could leak those on the dark web, but we want to hold the victim to ransom. So what we can do is use this ransom payload, and then you'll see in this directory where all of the extensions are, .text and so on. If we run it again, all of those files are now encrypted. So the user can't access their files. If they want to access them, they've got to contact us. If they don't want us to leak their files on the dark web, they've got to contact us. We now have full leverage over that victim and can unfortunately manipulate them to our will. So again, this is the same demo as before, just with a few tweaks to the payloads and the scripts that I used to bypass Defender for Enterprise. But as you can see, end to end, the same attack scenario plays out. So what we'll do now is move over to the Defender for Enterprise management interface and have a look at what that has found. You can see here we have our multi-stage incident involving privilege escalation. And Defender has recorded most stages of the attack. So you can see from the initial PowerShell commands that we used to the UAC bypass. You can see here it's got an understanding of what has happened there, the machine that is affected, and so on. We can also see that it thinks that it's blocked that UAC bypass behavior, but of course it didn't. We were able to gain connection to that C2 server that it thinks that it has intervened with, but unfortunately it hasn't. So this is kind of in some respect, a false negative, but like I said, it's blocked something, potentially a parent process, but the actual attack has got through. So this is a bit deceiving. And then as we go up through the attack, you can see it's understood the Mimikatz credential theft tool usage. It's understood the Meterpreter usage and the mechanisms that we've then later used to gain persistence, as highlighted here. But one thing I've noticed with Defender for Enterprise is it is sometimes very slow to update this incident list. So for example, you'll notice the one thing we don't see here is the ransomware detonation at the end. And Defender will eventually detect this, but I've seen it take upwards of half an hour for it to actually show in the platform. So it's just something to be aware of, that your ability to detect, to be alerted on, and to react to such a breach may take longer than desired. But that being said, Defender for Enterprise does provide a benefit over Free Defender in that you have this visibility from a centralized location. It does provide better protection versus Free Defender, but it was still ultimately very easy to bypass. So we've summarized how Defender for Enterprise fares versus Free Defender. Now let's compare it to Cortex XDR. If you've seen the first part of this video, then this will be the same content, so feel free to skip ahead to the conclusion. Well, the good news is we saw everything. To state it as a summary, we can see we've got 50 different issues of various severities. We have different issue sources, being the agent, analytical, behavioral IOCs, and even our Palo Alto firewall that was sat within the subnet detected some suspicious activity too. Various playbooks were run off the back of those issues. We can also see we've got 34 different artifacts, being the Meterpreter reverse shell, which is flagged as malware, the ransom script, which is also flagged as malware, and you can see various other processes, payloads that were involved. Even the IP address of the Kali Linux machine was flagged. We can also see the various assets that were involved, including the marketing PC, the system user that was compromised, and the KNurkM user. We can also see here we've got an interesting flag against that user, that this machine or this user has had the Active Directory policy applied to never expire their password. Well, given what's just happened, maybe we should change that policy. Now, from a MITRE perspective, we can look at this from this drop-down, and you can see we've recorded everything from the initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation, and so on, all the way down to the impact where we had that ransomware activity. So let's move over to our individual issues and insights, and again, we can track this chronologically. So starting at the bottom, we've got our local analysis of the malware payload. Moving beyond that, we've got UAC bypass, where we modified the registry settings to achieve that. For those of you that are interested, I won't go into too much detail in this demo, but this bypass was achieved using a variation of the FOD-helper exploit, which is why we're seeing these registry modifications. So we've got masquerading, we've got different process creations, execution of significantly renamed lolbin. The reason why this occurs is because one of the detection mechanisms that Microsoft implemented to detect the FOD-helper exploit was if you try to execute something like PowerShell.exe from that registry key. Now, it's pretty easy to get around that because it's a string detection, so what I did was create a random file that is a copy of PowerShell and then executed the encoded command from that, which is why we're seeing this behavior being recognized. Then we can see we've got PowerShell recognition of base64 encoded commands. There's the FOD helper process that's being exploited, running that base64. Moving up next, you can see we've got our first detection from the firewall. So this is nothing to do with the agent. This is the firewall that's sitting between the victim and the Kali machine, detecting that we have a TCP shell established between those two, and this is being flagged as a backdoor. Let's assume, for example, that even if the agent wasn't configured to block this, with the firewall in place here, it would have blocked it as well. So we've got kind of multiple layers of defense in depth from that perspective. The addition of the exclusion list that I set within Defender is recorded here, as you can see. And then as we move up, we can see this is all to do with the transfer of the Meterpreter payload. The Palo Alto firewall has also recognized that the Metasploit Meterpreter connection was attempted. So we've detected that from a network level as well. The escalation into service, we've recorded that here, so we can understand that this user was doing privilege escalation and then was able to access and execute commands running as system. And then the persistence mechanism, you can see here the random service that was added, the various registry keys, the service that was started. This is more of a behavioral mechanism. Obviously the different process injection techniques, they were also recorded as well. We can also see here, for example, the process injection that we had our original process running from try to write a PE header to the remote process of winlogon.exe. So again, we've recorded that. And then finally, if we just work our way up, I won't go through too many more of these. These are all to do with the various commands, the extraction mechanisms, and so on that we executed within that Meterpreter prompt. The most interesting ones are the credential gathering protection engine. When we did the LSA dump using Mimikatz, this is recorded within Cortex. And then finally, the ransomware activity itself that we ended the attack on. Now, if you want to go through any more of these and extract more information, of course we can. So for example, if we look at our firewall issue, let's open the causality chain in a new tab. We can take a look at kind of what we recorded, how we stitched some of that data together. And if we zoom in, it kind of gives us a story of the attack. So pancompliance.exe, we can see that that payload was executed. There were a number of detections to do with that. But then we had various PowerShell executions off the back of that. So we can see here, for example, that we had this PowerShell command that executed a script which are called fod.ps1. Again, this is just part of the evasion technique, calling a script rather than the process itself. But ultimately, the process was called fodhelper.exe. So this gives us some insight into what the attacker was doing. And of course, we can click on any of the behaviors to understand why has this been flagged. Moving on, we can see our randomly renamed PowerShell, which then executed the subsequent base64 encoded command. Ultimately, this led to the execution and download of Meterpreter, which was then executed, as you can see here, Meterpreter reverse.exe, running in the path that was excluded, hence it wasn't flagged. And the interesting thing on this particular causality chain is that not only do we have the detection chain from the perspective of the agent, but we can also see that this same marketing PC, zoom in a bit more, this same marketing PC tried to communicate to this IP address at the same time and triggered a warning on the firewall. So if we click on this behavior, you can see that there was a vulnerability exploit detection on the Palo Alto firewall. It was classed as a vulnerability with a high severity, but it was only detected. It wasn't blocked. So depending on how you configure this, obviously the agent could have blocked this attack. The firewall could have also blocked this attack if those engines were configured to do so. So this is just like one way to view the attack, but it's interesting to see the agent telemetry and the firewall telemetry kind of stitched together in this example. But of course, If you want to understand, well, what is this attack actually doing, rather than diving into all of the different processes, we can click on Forensic Highlights, and then we can see from a MITRE perspective what was actually done. And we can see execution, discovery, defense evasion, and so on. So the last thing I just want to show quickly is to do with the ransomware activity itself. So if we open up the causality card for the ransomware detection, this kind of gives us some interesting insight into what the attacker ultimately achieved. So we can see here the behavior that we detected was ransomware activity, script ransomware encrypted victim files, and this was detected through our behavioral threat protection engine. And we also have a suspicious PowerShell script detected. If we click on the PowerShell process itself and then pull up the all events here, we can actually get an understanding of, well, what was PowerShell doing then? Let's click on files, move this up, and if we pull in the action type alongside it, we can see we've got file read, write, create, delete. Write, create, read, delete. And as you can see, what's happening is the script was reading a certain file, it was renaming it, and then it was ultimately deleting the original file. So again, the user has no access to the original. The attacker does, because we transferred that to the Kali machine. But the victim is left with an encrypted file that they can't do anything with. And you can see all of the records of those various encrypted files. This was all configured in a listen-only mode, hence why we've got a lot of alerts and nothing was blocked. But if you were to configure the Cortex agent in prevention mode, then it would have been blocked at the very first stage. As soon as we scan that malware, we would have identified that, okay, no, that's not good, it doesn't look legitimate, it would have been blocked. The UAC bypass mechanism wouldn't have even started. But even if that got through, then the subsequent alert would have kicked in. So effectively what we've got here, both on the agent and on the firewall where we had those various detections, we have at least 50 different opportunities to intervene and prevent this attack. Now, I know there will be those of you thinking, look, we like the look of Cortex, it sounds great, it's providing visibility, the protection and so on, but we've got Defender right now and we need a fix right now. We don't have time to waste. So what can I recommend? Well, there are two very quick and easy fixes that you can implement. Number one is to mandate that UAC always notifies. Now, this comes with a bit of a catch. This is going to cause a lot of pushback from your users because they are going to be bombarded with pop-ups, but this would ultimately prevent the attack in that initial stage. The UAC bypass would not work. Having said that, because of its intrusiveness, you probably only want to enable this on very sensitive or kind of VIP machines. The other thing you can do if you're using Defender for Enterprise is to disable local admin merge. By default, this is set to either not configured or enabled, which means that local exclusions can be configured alongside MDE configured exclusions. This means that during the attack where I define those exclusion paths where Meterpreter can execute from, if you were to disable local admin merge, in other words, disable the ability for exclusions to be set locally on the device, that would have also stopped the attack in its tracks. Now, it wouldn't have dealt with the initial stage with that reverse shell, but it would have prevented the subsequent Meterpreter phases. Alright, thank you for watching part 2 of this video series. Hopefully you found it interesting and useful. To reiterate, this was not designed to be a competitive video, nor was it designed to be an advanced attack scenario tutorial or anything like that. It was simply to provide some degree of education around why default security is not necessarily good security when you're trying to defend yourselves against sophisticated attacks, and why solutions like Cortex XDR or XIM are such powerful and useful solutions to help you do just that. Again, thank you for watching. This is Nathaniel Moore signing out.